For more than 15 years, Facebook has been bringing you the news that matters, like whose birthday you're going to ignore today.
But seriously though, it's much easier to get news on Facebook because a lot of the news sources that we trust happen to be on Facebook. So it's much easier to check in on the news while also checking what your best friend was really up to last night. All of that changed last week when the Australian government changed the rules of the game and Facebook played hardball.
Facebook has sent a blunt and shocking message to the world. Any attempt to force it to pay for news content will mean an end to those feeds. The country woke up today to find most Australian news pages were just a blank space.
Australia wanted new media bargaining laws, which meant that they wanted Facebook and Google to pay set rates to media companies for content. Facebook hit back by blacking out all news content in Australia, though it ended by blocking a lot of other pages too, including emergency response services and cancer charities.
This will have consequences for people who are trying to access health news during a pandemic.
So that meant that if you were a news provider in Australia, you could no longer share content on Facebook. Or if you were simply somebody who just logged on to Facebook to share your family pictures, you still could not share news content on Facebook. Now, Facebook says this was their last choice. The Australian government, on the other hand, well,
this is outrageous and unacceptable. We expect that Facebook will fix these actions immediately and never repeat them again. This is an assault on a sovereign nation.
Wow. Nothing really like being blocked on Facebook to really trigger FOMO, right? But what exactly is going on here? So there are two players here, the providers and the platforms. Now, the providers are the news companies who generate content and who need those ready-made audiences that are available on Google and Facebook. On the other hand, the platforms, that's Facebook and Google, need the content from the providers to keep their users engaged. So the question is, who needs who more?
News is not valuable to either company. News in Google News has no ads on it. In Facebook News, as your correspondent said, is less than 4% of the traffic. In some ways, Facebook may be better off. It can return to its roots of puppies and parties and getting dates.
For Facebook, in fact, running actual news has been a bit of a hit and miss project. Misinformation, fake news, banning Donald Trump. I mean, is it even worth the trouble for Mark Zuckerberg? Well, certainly worth enough that Zuckerberg spent the entire weekend in talks with the Australian government.
Facebook will restore Australian news pages to its platform in the coming days.
Well, Facebook has refriended Australia, and Australian news will be restored to the Facebook platform. And Facebook has committed to entering into good faith negotiations with Australian news media businesses in seeking to reach agreements to pay for content.
According to Reuters, Facebook and Australia have struck a concession deal. Australia will offer 4 amendments, including to the mechanism for final offer arbitration, which had been a sticking point for Facebook. That essentially refers to the clause that the Australian government had proposed in the new laws that an independent arbiter would have the final word on how much Facebook or Google would pay for news that it took from a media company, particularly in the case of small news companies, which may not have had the bargaining power that they would need against these two Goliaths. Now, why only these two companies? Let's rewind a little bit. In 2018, an Australian government regulator launched an inquiry into the impact of Google and Facebook on competition in media and advertising. It ended up recommending a code of conduct to level the playing field. Cut to 2020, when the Australian government unveiled a draft law to enforce the code. In 2021, the Australian Parliament began debating this law, which applied to only 2 companies, Facebook and Google, because Australian regulators felt that these are the 2 companies that are skewing the market the most. So how exactly are they doing this? Now, just imagine there's a news website called biginterview.com, and they go ahead and interview a K-pop band. And let's say about 1,000 people read about this interview on the news website. But there are 10,000 more who read the same interview on the Facebook page of this website. So who makes money? It's not biginterview.com, it's not the K-pop band, it's actually Facebook and Google. The Australian law that was passed last week was an attempt to try and change that equation just a wee bit.
The fact of the matter over here is that news publications and tech giants have a disproportionate balance in terms of the revenue that they share with each other. For content published and ads shown basis that YouTube, which is the best revenue sharing tech giant in this world, still takes 55% of its ad revenue from its content producers. The share is somewhat similar also for Google and Facebook, which leads to the imbalance that is being complained about by news publications around the world right now.
Google has already got into paid deals worth millions of dollars with Australia's two biggest media companies, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp and Nine Entertainment. So where does this leave the rest?
Upstarts, startups, new companies that try to compete with that oligopoly, they are in a mess. And I think anybody that tries to open up the media oligopoly of Australia really gets hurt by this.
So what do Australia's new laws mean for news companies in other countries? Well, ultimately, it boils down to this simple question. How much can you regulate the internet? The future, as Facebook would put it, it's complicated.